Thersites the Historian here. I just finished watching the Iowa Democratic debate, which I believe was the 8th Democratic debate, perhaps the 7th, I can't recall right offhand. This debate took place on January 14, 2020 at Drake University in Iowa. It was hosted by the Des Moines Register and CNN, by which I mean CNN with a local journalist there for some reason or other. The debate carried many of the typical CNN biases. Since Bernie Sanders has been surging, the questions were extraordinarily biased against him. Almost every question was actually fairly heavily barbed before it was delivered to Bernie. We've seen plenty of debates like that, but none of them quite as explicitly biased as this one. When I get to my coverage of Bernie's performance, I will talk about some of the questions that he received. What I'll do is list all the candidates in order of worst to best. There were 3 candidates who, in my opinion, were absolutely horrific tonight. The overall quality of this debate was not terrible because the topics they talked about were interesting, but the performance of 3 of the candidates was absolute garbage. There were 2 people who did okay. I don't know if they necessarily gained all that much or lost all that much, but they didn't damage themselves and they may have advanced the ball a little bit. And then there's actually one person who I think did quite a bit to advance his cause, although he still has a long way to go to create viability. So, now that we've talked about the moderators, CNN of course being deeply biased, as we'll explore as we go along, let's get into the candidates, starting with the absolute worst performer of the night. Coming in dead last is Pete Buttigieg. The mayor of South Bend came on the stage, and from the outset, he looked absolutely terrified of Amy Klobuchar. He literally refused to make eye contact with her, and when she gave him a grin, he looked like he was going to die. He looked like he was afraid of her launching another onslaught. He didn't dare to cross her path the whole debate, and he also didn't dare to cross anyone's paths lest he be attacked again. He looked like a broken man. For a guy who is still within striking distance in the first 2 primary states, that is a weird look. While he is down in the polls some, I don't understand why he feels quite that despondent. But apparently maybe he knows something we don't, or he just had a bad day for other reasons. At any rate, though, this was perhaps his worst debate performance, and that's saying a lot considering how bad he was during the last debate. At least he had a little bit of life in him in the last debate. In this debate, he came in defeated and stayed there. Just to give you an example, there were at least 2 or 3 occasions where Tom Steyer took pot shots at Pete over Pete's weakness on environmental policies. Pete absorbed those shots and then moved on as if they didn't happen. He had no clap back, there was no defense. Now maybe he was trying to overcorrect for his tendency to overreact when he's attacked and become thin-skinned, but it ended up just looking plain weak rather than petulant. So he went from one terrible look to another. He played up his Midwestern identity quite a bit, as did Amy Klobuchar, and he also played up his Washington is bad, I have outside the Beltway experience, blah 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 angle as well. So nothing new. When he was asked about being commander-in-chief and the issue with Iran that recently almost blew up into war, he had okay-ish answers, but he didn't really say anything terribly interesting. He had one mini moment where he talked about seeing soldiers he knew have to kiss their kids goodbye when they went off to war. He talked about how it would always be a last resort for him. But in terms of substantive answers about how to conduct foreign policy, there wasn't really much there. The only thing he was able to pull off was an age appeal, since he has had personal involvement with these conflicts, but the other candidates were too old to do so. There was one question asked of him that was, I'll admit, unfair, although I did laugh at it. And that question was when the one black reporter from CNN asked him why he says that black voters just don't know him, when in all probability they do know him at this point, they just don't like him. His answer ended up being a rambling mess where he said that all of the people who do know him support him, and it's just a matter of him getting to know the black community, and then they will all flock to his cause because he's amazing. Really not a good answer, and he said it with zero confidence or zero energy, and it just made him look even worse I'll admit, anytime you're asked a difficult and barbed question like that, you're going to take hits. But say, if you look at Bernie by contrast, when Bernie's asked questions like that, he tends to break even rather than just die on the stage. Pete kind of died on that one. He had a decent answer when it came to drawing a contrast with Trump in debates if the two of them were to go head to head. He talks about how Trump had bone spurs that got him out of service. Pete served voluntarily. And he talked about how Trump might try to play up the God card to appeal to religious voters, but then Pete could talk about how God has no political party. Now, this is hardly a brilliant answer by any stretch of the imagination, but by Pete's standards, this was the pinnacle of his night. This was as good as it got, and it was only downhill from there. His closing statement was weak and sounded desperate. As I said, he started out weak and afraid and stayed there the whole night. His closing appeal was basically that whoever wins the nomination needs to be able to win the election by a big margin to kill Trumpism. If you'll get any head-to-head poll, Pete is clearly not the guy to do that. He does not do well in head-to-heads with Trump. So that is an argument that he made which is undermining his own legitimacy pretty badly. He talked about how we need to fight the Washington mindset. He was exposed as a McKinsey consultant by Tom Steyer. That is the ultimate Washington mindset. He talks about voters of color will join him, or they should join him. He invited them to join him. He then invited Republicans to join him. His strategy apparently is, well, I might win if only voters of color just randomly have a change of heart, and then Republicans show up and vote in the Democratic primaries. So basically, this is the equivalent of when Cory Booker 2 debates ago literally ended his debate by begging to be allowed back onto the next debate stage. Pretty bad stuff. But the next person didn't do much better, and on an objective level may have actually been worse. Much like his rival from South Bend, Indiana, Joe Biden did not look very good tonight. He looked sleepy enough and sufficiently off his game that even CNN commented on it. It's pretty rare for CNN to say that Joe Biden looked bad or that he looked incoherent or to imply that perhaps he was not with it, but it was noticeable enough that they had to say something. That tells you all you need to know. Every time Joe Biden was questioned about something, he would squint approximately at the camera, maybe beside the camera, and then reference something from the Obama era. He would reference pieces of legislation or something that he did or said. Sometimes he would reference back to the 1980s, but he didn't really seem to have much in terms of a plan going forward. His answers, if I had to characterize them simply, would contain some decent parts and some details, but he never had quite the level of coherence required to create a comprehensive whole. So when it came to foreign policy, what he said didn't make sense. He talked about the need to retain some troops in the Middle East, and he said, yes, we need special forces, but not combat troops. And he said that at least twice, and no one said anything. Needless to say, that is oxymoronic at best and completely brainless at worst. Special forces are by definition combat troops. They literally are the ultimate experts in combat. I think he may have been trying to reference Green Berets who were there for training purposes, but he didn't quite specify that in a clear fashion. He also had some really incoherent responses to Bernie on trade and Warren on healthcare. Bernie was against the USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, and Biden seems to be for it, but the way that he phrased it made it unclear where he actually stood. And when he was sparring with Warren on healthcare, he also really was off his game, and it was very hard to figure out what he was trying to say. So he came off as incredibly weak in all of those exchanges. And if anybody was listening to him, and I know a lot of voters have seen enough of him at this point that they do have some suspicions and they're willing to jump ship if he shows weakness, I think this might be just the performance that he needed to start shedding more voters. The only thing that's really helping him right now is that a lot of other neoliberal centrists are dropping out of the race, and Biden is someone that people support by default. Only his proven resilience to bad performances makes me place him above Pete Buttigieg. If this were based purely on objective performance and not on what these candidates did to advance themselves to the next level, then I would have to make Biden the absolute loser. But as it is, Pete needed a big night. He got a terrible night. Biden just needed a mediocre night, and he also got a terrible night. So I guess he came a little closer. So he didn't lose by quite as much. I haven't looked up too much debate coverage at this juncture, but based on the handful of headlines that are available at the time of recording, it looks like everyone has decided that Elizabeth Warren ran away with this debate. At least all the people who write for the mainstream press. However, they will be proven objectively wrong by the time the next poll comes out. She's almost certain to be crowned the official winner, but we'll see. Elizabeth Warren's key moment, the thing that will be repeated and go viral and annoy the shit out of you on people's Facebook feeds if your friends happen to be Warren supporters like mine are, is that Elizabeth Warren nailed Bernie on the issue of whether or not he said in a private meeting in December 2018 that a woman couldn't beat Trump. He denied that this ever happened, and then she basically said, yeah, it did. And then some of her supporters who were on the panel at CNN were going crazy as if this was like the most brilliant thing that had ever happened and just some knockout blow to Bernie that proves that he's a sexist and that something, I don't know. So there are a couple problems here. One is that nobody gives a shit what was said between two friends in an office in December of 2018. Two is that if Bernie did say that, then that is just a punditry opinion on electability. That's not even sexist in of itself. Three, that is not something Bernie Sanders would say, especially when December 2018 was right in the wake of him having helped elect people like AOC and others who clearly have a lot of political juice. So the idea here that she is going to nail him on this is comical. If we think about the average voter, not the average former Hillary Clinton supporter who's really desperate to have a woman president, but the average well-adjusted American, how do you think they will take this if it's a he said, she said situation? On the one hand, you have Bernie Sanders, who is almost universally recognized as honest even by Trump supporters who think he's crazy. On the other hand, you have Elizabeth Warren, who lied for decades about being a Native American, something that everyone knows about her, by the way. Whose word would you take in a one-on-one? Elizabeth Warren made a massive mistake by trying to have a credibility fight with Bernie Sanders. This is perhaps the dumbest thing that she's done in this entire campaign. So Van Jones, after the debate, said, yeah, she came in with a real plan for this debate and she executed. She did execute. It would be like if you shot yourself in the foot and then walked around without wincing to show people how tough you are. You proved that you're tough, but your foot will never be the same. And you might bleed out if you persist in this dumb stunt too long. She hurt herself. She hurt herself bad. Make no mistake about it. So in general, Warren did a good job talking about corruption and healthcare. Those are always the two big things that she's good at talking about. When it goes beyond that, however, Warren doesn't have a lot of depth. Or I should say breadth. She has depth on those topics, but she lacks breadth when it comes to the span of things that a president would have to be responsible for. Her foreign policy was a mix of the usual platitudes that she lays out, but she did make a few good points here and there, talking about the need to end the revolving door between the military and the war profit industry. She also took a strong and clear stand on withdrawing from the Middle East, talking about how there's no path to victory, and the generals always say we're about to turn the corner, but by this point we're just going in circles. There is no path to victory, we should just get out. I think that she made that case clearly. She and Bernie both made it, but perhaps Warren made it a little more memorably. The real problem here, to circle back to this grand victory moment she supposedly had, is that Warren pushed women's identity politics beyond the breaking point. Identity politics doesn't work, at least not in this cycle. Maybe in 2016 it still had some juice, but that juice is long exhausted. The only people who care about this shit are the kinds of people who write articles for BuzzFeed and Jezebel. No one else cares, at least not enough people to win a presidential primary. If we look at the people who have promoted women's identity politics in this race, we started out with Gillibrand, who literally said, Women of America, listen to me, and self-described as a 52-year-old young mom. How did her campaign end again? Then we had Kamala Harris, who took up this mantle, and yeah, she flopped horribly despite having all kinds of media favor and being basically handed the reins of the party if only she could prove competent enough to handle the horse. She flopped. Booker played identity politics of a different variety. He just dropped out, and he never got above about 3%. And 3% is generous. It's actually probably like 1.5 was his peak. So if you've noticed a pattern, the pattern is that all the candidates who've campaigned on identity politics have failed spectacularly. Elizabeth Warren is playing a strategy of people that she outlasted. And she's copying that strategy in a slavish way that undermines her own credibility and her own message. This is something I detected in the last debate, but that she took to the nth degree here. It was so bad and so explicit that even my girlfriend, who likes Warren, I mean, she supports Bernie, but she likes Warren too, was cringing hard every time Warren kept pushing the female identity politics angle. It was painful. It was extraordinarily obvious that she was trying to play divide and conquer and try to dredge up the old anger of the pissed off Hillary voters who feel like Bernie deprived her of her moment in the sun. Just straight up pathetic and disappointing, and I think this is something that is not going to be lost on many people. Warren will definitely take a hit from this. She was already in danger of not picking up delegates out of Iowa, and now the danger becomes even more real for her. Coming in third place, and now we're in the people who performed okay, Amy Klobuchar. Now, Amy, of course, is extraordinarily boring, and it's often hard to pay attention to her when she talks, but she was strong and steady. She especially looked stronger by how Pete was clearly afraid of her. She significantly received no pushback for any of her milquetoast claims or all of her claims about being pragmatic, electable, etc. She played Midwestern identity politics and talked a little bit about being a woman, but by contrast with Warren, seemed reasonable and likable on that issue. She didn't make anyone cringe there. She actually backed away from the cringe a lot more than usual. She had a couple moments that I cringed at, but nothing too bad. She embraced the USMCA, which I think might damage her. I don't think she's really got a shot anyway, to be completely honest. And her appeal on that was basically think of the farmers here in Iowa. So that was a pretty weak defense of USMCA. She's basically saying we need to reinstate it, or it's basically just the revised version of NAFTA. She doesn't really seem to see any problems with it. Warren supports it, but at least she acknowledges there are problems. Klobuchar just is straight out pro-free trade, so despite her Midwestern appeal, this will damage her with voters. She said that we need to allow for natural gas as a transition fuel. This is idiotic unless you're trying to transition from 1852, where coal was discovered, or approximately around there, to, say, 1912. It's not a transition fuel in 2020. We're in the future. We're in the 21st century. We can transition with something a little more sophisticated than natural gas. Please and thank you. So other than those two moments, which were straight up dumb, she is just generic. She had a generic closer talking about unity and electability. It's exactly what you would expect her to say if you had to create a computer-generated model to simulate her. So we don't really need to say much more. I still believe she might be running for VP rather than president. And given her lack of aggressiveness and her boring stances and talk about electability, that seems quite likely. Who would be willing to pick her, I don't know. But at this point, because of Warren's aggressively women, women, women rhetoric, I have to guess that Klobuchar is hoping that Warren makes a comeback and that she can get a slot on the ticket. Coming in second place is Bernie Sanders. As one of the only two people who stands a real chance of winning the primary outright as things stand right now, tonight was actually more crucial for him than for anyone else. As mentioned with Joe Biden, all he needed to do was be mediocre. He didn't quite make that bar. But with Bernie, what he needs is to maintain and grow his momentum and then win the first two states in order to build enough momentum to carry forward. I'm not sure if he did enough tonight to make that happen, but certainly he didn't get knocked out either. I would say that his performance had a lot more positive than negative, but it was certainly not one of his stronger showings. Just to give you an example of how the questions were biased against him, here are some of them. I will go through them from my notes. This could take a little while, but it's worth doing simply because it is quite stunning how biased CNN is against this man. So on the question of the USMCA, he was asked something along the lines of Americans are suffering without trade relations being what they should be. Why do you oppose the USMCA? It was framed pretty negatively. On the issue of the statement he supposedly made in the office with Warren, they basically said, you said this back in this time period. He said he didn't say it, and he said so clearly. Then he talked about why he would never say it. Then when they had Warren give a rebuttal, they said, how did you feel when Bernie said that? So the framing was 100,000,000% biased. Then we get to Medicare for All. They asked him a question that had to do with affordability, but the way that they phrased it verbally and then what they wrote on screen were slightly different, so that would make it look like he was dodging the question. The question on screen was, do voters deserve to see an overall price tag? The way that they framed it was more about, will you give us an overall price tag? And there's a difference there, because the part about do voters deserve makes it seem like if he doesn't answer it that he's being contemptuous of voters. And then when they asked the next person, they said, do you think that voters deserve to hear a price tag for Bernie? So they're trying to give the impression that Bernie misheard the question, when in reality they asked it a little differently. Later on, when he was talking about, when they asked him about his overall program and how much it would cost, they said, you will double the budget in a decade, will you bankrupt the country? They never asked these questions about payment to anybody else. And again, I can't think of a more negative way to frame this than, will you bankrupt the country? That's literally as hostile a framework as you could create. When we got to the issue of their overall message, they said some number of people say that they're not interested in socialism. How could you as a democratic socialist win the election? And that's not super hostile, but it's still more hostile than what they asked everybody else. With the exception of that question that Pete got asked about his black support, all of the negative questions came Bernie's way. And I honestly didn't hear one question that was positive. A few of them were neutral, but most of them were just straight up negative. So again, when the questions are biased against you that heavily, victory in an outright sense, any kind of home run performance, is completely out of the question. One thing he didn't do that I've been hoping for him to do ever since the very beginning is that he has not pointed out the current price tag in trillions of dollars of the current healthcare system for the federal government. Now, what he ended up doing was talking about the cost for regular Americans, and that seems to be a winning message. People are responding to that quite positively. So basically, if I had to summarize it, Bernie was Bernie on healthcare. If you've seen any of these debates, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was a good message, but it was the same. That critique has been leveled at him many times. In this debate, it was actually true, but he keeps taking the same attacks, so why would he have different answers? It kind of makes sense if you think about it. He managed to draw a strong contrast with Biden on votes for the Bush-era wars. Unlike many of the other candidates, he did admit that his vote on Afghanistan was wrong. I guess, to be fair, most of the other candidates weren't in office yet. But he said that we need to be aware that administrations can lie about wars, and we need to be weary of sending troops into harm's way based on lies. Biden, of course, had no pushback. Normally, Biden would be a little sharper and would at least say, come on, man, or something like that. But in this case, he just stood there and got hit. He didn't back down from Warren's obviously rehearsed attack, which I believe was modeled directly on Kamala's attack on Biden in that one debate. And he did push back on her electability argument. Warren said, the men on the stage have lost 10 elections between them, but the women haven't lost any. But the fact is, Warren's only been in maybe 1 or 2 elections ever, and they were both in deep blue Massachusetts. So those don't even really count, if you ask me. Klobuchar's record's pretty impressive when it comes to elections, but Warren has no right to piggyback on that. Her argument was that she's the only person in the last 30 years to be an incumbent Republican. And then she talked about, but she didn't talk about who or the circumstances. In 2012, she beat Scott Brown, in Massachusetts. Scott Brown won by the skin of his teeth in a Republican wave in 2010 against an extraordinarily terrible candidate named Martha Coakley, who was an open Yankees fan in fucking Massachusetts. So, not a hard contest, and she still won by less than most other Democrats won. And that was in a state which again was deep blue in a presidential year where people actually show up in larger numbers than was the case in 2010. Most Democrats win by at least 10. I think she only won by 5, or maybe it's... No, she won with 55% of the vote rather than the normal 60. That's what I meant to say. So Warren, really not that electable, despite what she says. Bernie didn't give clap back on that, but what he did give clap back on was saying that someone else had won an election against an incumbent Republican in the last 30 years. He did it back in 1990. And then she said, yeah, but that was 1990. He said, well, you said the last 30 years. That was 30 years ago. So that part got a little dumb, but Warren was trying to be sarcastic and make it like he was a relic, and she ended up looking a little bit petty. The thing that Bernie did, which I think will help him the most, is that he took a strong stand against the USMCA. Now, CNN is super free trade, and they framed this very negatively and gave everyone else a chance to sort of soft hit Bernie on it. But he took a strong stand. He said that this needs to be negotiated by labor and by the environmental movements. And the reason that he's not backing it is because it doesn't have enough environmental protections, and it forces us to continue on a path, a race to the bottom with low-wage countries, especially Mexico. So what Bernie said makes sense to anybody who understands how wages work and understands the job drain created by free trade. Warren, by contrast, had a much shittier answer. She made some of the same points as Bernie, but came to a different conclusion that we just need to make this deal and then try to make a better one later. He refuted that pretty effectively. Bernie also had strong answers on childcare and climate change, but these were not super different than what a lot of his competitors said, so it wasn't all that extraordinary. I think Bernie did enough to help his momentum continue, and he also was able to stand up to attacks. The media will say that he got crushed by Warren, but I don't think anybody who actually saw what happened would come to that conclusion. After the debate, some of the pro-Warren surrogates were on a panel, and I watched just a few minutes of CNN. One of them said basically that Warren should have been more aggressive and that she had Bernie on the ropes and could have knocked him out. Or Van Jones said that Bernie slipped on a big banana peel. And then this woman kept going on and saying that there were 4 independent sources. This is journalistically proven and Bernie can't just deny it. Then Anderson Cooper pointed out, well, all 4 of those sources have to have a single source. Only one person could have possibly informed these 4 anonymous sources of what was said in that room, and that was Elizabeth Warren. So it will never and can never be more than a he said, she said situation. And again, who has more credibility, Bernie Sanders or fake Indian Elizabeth Warren? Yeah, exactly. So Bernie came through. He might have taken some hits. Perhaps some of that Hillary anger will revive, and some of the adamant Hillary supporters will renew their assaults, but I don't think it will be effective. However, it will be a hindrance, and it was not ideal, although it was good enough, hopefully. If we're thinking in relative terms about who did the most to put himself in a position to win Iowa and then go on to win the primary as a whole, then we could name Bernie Sanders as the winner. However, in all of these videos, what I've always done is to name the winner as the person who did the most to advance his or her campaign as a whole and to build themselves up in order to move forward. And the person who did the most in order to try to construct an electoral coalition and make himself viable down the line is without a doubt Tom Steyer. Steyer realizes where his opportunity lies. Pete Buttigieg is incredibly weak, and he is shedding voters like a dog during the summer. He's gunning for Pete, and Pete didn't defend himself. Pete rolled over and died for Tom Steyer tonight. Make no mistake about it. And by not giving any backfire to Tom Steyer, it made him look good. It looked like Tom Steyer was making irrefutable points against Pete, because Pete had no defense. He offered nothing. Tom also avoided all conflict with everyone else. He would just agree with and build upon points made by Bernie, Warren, etc., and he came across as very congenial and constructive. To the many Democratic voters out there who are undecided and who don't like conflict or disagreement among their candidates, Tom probably appeared to them to be a leader. He was allowed to paint himself positively, and his answers were mostly solid. I can't think of any answers that he had which were outright stupid. He legitimized himself as more than a guy flooding your local television market. He seemed like a real candidate. And it sickens me to say it, but he gained the most out of this debate of anyone up there. Tom Steyer is clearly a fraud, but he is very good at being just that. So I suspect that he will continue to eat into Pete's support, maybe gain some of Biden's support. Perhaps this will be the path Bernie needs to win Iowa. Now, going forward throughout the primary, I actually think Steyer is a danger that we should not underestimate. Unlike Bloomberg, Steyer is someone who has at least a little bit of charisma. He's got a message that actually resonates with the base, and he clearly has the ability to engage in debates in a way that portrays him positively. He's pretty good with exchanges with other candidates, so I think that he emerged tonight as a legitimate threat to all of the real candidates in the race. His campaign is no longer a novelty money pit. He actually might be able to do something. And if you look at his numbers in Nevada and South Carolina, you see that Steyer does appeal to voters for real. So this is something to be scared of. It's something to be aware of. And yeah, if Steyer ends up making a big run for it, don't say that I didn't warn you. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Good night and good luck. Hopefully I'm wrong about Steyer. Hopefully no one likes him and he won't go anywhere. But I have a suspicion that he will.